You're listening to Bigfoot Society, and I'm Jeremiah Byron. In this show, we go beyond the campfire stories to bring you firsthand encounters from people who say they've seen something impossible, from backwoods trails and remote mountain haulers to quiet farms and crowded highways. The stories come from everywhere, and each one leaves us with more questions than answers. These are the voices of the people who've lived it, so settle in, because today you'll hear another account that just might change the way you see the woods forever. So stay with us. All right, Bigfoot Society, I've got the privilege of talking to John Coster today. John is an individual I got connected to. He is a songwriter, musician, author, and Harvard graduate. And he's on the show to share about his encounters out there in Western Massachusetts that are written about in his book, Convergence: Encounters with an Impossible Being, which is a fantastic read. I've read it as well. And before I hand things over to John, I just want to say this is a privilege to have John on the show. Longtime listeners will know that I grew up in Northfield, which is the northern part of the Pioneer Valley. So I've always tried my hardest to get individuals on that would talk about places like the Quabbin or Amherst, Hadley, Greenfield, Northfield, Gill, and it's really, really, really hard to get those individuals on. So it's great to be able to talk to an individual who's kind of mentions locations in that general area in his book. But, welcome to the show, John. How are you doing today?
I'm doing great. So thanks for having me. And I had forgotten that you were from this part of the country. That's very interesting. Yeah.
Absolutely. And it's a thing where there, as you know, there's more with Bigfoot that goes on in this part of the country than most people know, because it's not really talked about publicly. And when I lived there growing up, I wasn't really in that mindset. So I wasn't going out and, into the different state forests and exploring for that. But now I'm like, oh, I got to get back there and kind of look at this a different way. But, John, your story is incredible. In I've read your book, and there's so much to it. So, would you mind kind of walking us through sharing what you've experienced over the years and how this all started for you?
No, not at all. Well, first of all, my own encounter, or the encounter I had with my partner at the time and very close friend forever, was the last thing in the world that I expected. Now, having said that, I have to admit and confess that I had since early childhood a kind of a fascination with Bigfoot / the abominable snowman. I can remember as a young boy reading some kind of I think it was an article about the abominable snowman in Argosy magazine. And that's a long, long, long time ago. Many years later, I found myself at Harvard, and in order to pass, I was studying history and literature. And in those days, and I think it's true today, we had to pass we had to take at least a full year of science. And I ended up studying human evolution, which, needless to say, made us take a look at a lot of the close cousins that we have, as a matter of fact, and close cousins in our evolutionary past, and that field has just dramatically exploded. So now that here it is all these years later, there's not just Neanderthal and Peking man, there's everything in between. There's all sorts of hominins or hominids, depending on your classification and stuff. A lot of close relatives to man, the living ones as well as the past ones, that some of whom led to our line of, are human beings as far as we understand things today. But having said that, every once in a while I read something about Sasquatch in the Northwest or something like that, and I was always kind of interested in the subject, partly because based on the science studies that I had back in Cambridge in those days, it always seemed like, well, when you consider how the ice ages came and went during the Pleistocene, and a lot of really violent weather changes happened, and there were all these big forms of animals, like we had giant, everything was bigger. We had a lot of giant creatures. We had, gigantic sloths, and we had mammoths. We had all these creatures that were called megafauna. And even though anything over 100 pounds, including us, is technically megafauna, nevertheless, it made a lot of sense that some primate would have adapted to the comings and goings of the ice ages during that period, that really long formative period called the Pleistocene, which only ended at the end of the last ice ages. And so we're kind of like barely out of it if you think of things in terms of geological time. So I just thought, well, a big, ape-like creature that's a close relative of man, it's almost would be surprising if something like that didn't exist. So that was kind of my background, but I hadn't really thought about any of this for a long time. And then I was living with my friend at that time, and up or at the beginning of this recent encounter, up in Pelham, Massachusetts, and we were about, just maybe as a crow flies, 4 or 5 miles from the Quabbin Reservoir, which is a very big wilderness area. The Quabbin is people refer to it as the accidental wilderness, or basically back, I think it was in the late 30s, the state developed a plan to dam up some of the rivers that ran through an old farming valley, and they built an enormous reservoir, and that reservoir is a major source of water for parts of eastern Massachusetts, like Boston and places like that. So it's very important, and it's important to keep the area really clean and wild because you don't want development around a reservoir. And it's a big reservoir. It has about 140 miles of shoreline with a lot of wild forest surrounding it. I forget how many. It's like 150. I forget the numbers of acres, but there's lots of square miles of very wild country all around it. And actually, where we were living, there was, at the time, there was even another big wildlife preserve between us and the highway. And on the other side of that was the whole Quabbin Forest Preserve. So it's a lot. There's everything is there that ever was here. I mean, everybody that I know that's spent a lot of time there and basically admits that there are the occasional cougar wandering through, and there are these big coyote wolf hybrids or whatever they are. We've seen them. And their moose are common, and relatively speaking. So the wildlife has kind of come back. So if you were going to encounter something strange, it was a pretty good area to encounter it. Well, anyhow, to get to the beginning of the story, which I describe in the book, one day, it was in September. Actually, it was the equinox, right? September 22nd. We decided to take a hike in that area because we were typically doing a lot of hiking. It's something we've always done. And so we went over to this particular area, and we're hiking down to a spot that's a really beautiful spot where you can look out over the water and see nothing. And you could imagine yourself somewhere in the wilderness. I mean, you're not far from civilization, but you can't see a single sign of it. You can look out and you can imagine yourself in some big wildlife park out in the west or something, And it got to be toward evening, and we decided it's time to get headed home, And so we started walking up this trail. It's maybe a half mile long. It wasn't that very long to where you could park a car. And the first thing that I noticed, maybe even unconsciously, now that I think about it, was that everything got very, very quiet. And if you know the woods in New England, you understand that mid to late September, particularly in the evening time around 6 and stuff, when the sun's just beginning to get low, but it's still pretty light out, it's a very loud time. All the bugs and the crickets and everything, they really go into the crescendo at the end of of summer. And so we're walking along, and I remember feeling just a strange kind of uneasiness, which I couldn't put my finger on. Now that I think back upon it, probably had to do with the strange silence, because even if I didn't register it consciously, the place was really quiet. All of the woods were really quiet. And so we're walking along up this trail, and to our right, there's an area that maybe had been logged out, maybe, I don't know, 5 or 10 years previously. In that area, there's a certain amount of logging is allowed, and it's all done with an eye toward, maintaining the forest in a good state. But they do take timber out of there periodically in certain sections, and this is one of those areas. So you had a wide view over maybe 100 yards or something at least. And I'm just walking along, feeling a little strange, and for no reason that I could put my finger on. And then all of a sudden, I turned around because I noticed that my friend Donna was not. All of a sudden, she wasn't right by my side, and I looked around, and she was staring off across this sort of brushy area that had been logged out, and she had this very perplexed look on her face. And she said something to the effect of, and it was a very strange question. She said, is it possible for a moose to be white? And I'm thinking, well, that's a weird question, but of course, every once in a while you have an albino deer, and maybe once in every 10 years, somewhere in the world there's an albino moose. I don't know, but these things happen. And I said, well, I don't know. And then she described that she'd seen something, and the reason she said moose is because it was so tall. And the only thing that we were aware of that could be really big and be any strange color would be a moose, because they're like 7 feet at the shoulder. I mean, I've had them run right by me. It's amazing how big they are. And so I didn't know. And then she started describing that she'd seen something, and it was white, and the white was really clear. It was a bright sunny day, even though the sun's way low on the horizon, but it was still bright. And she described it as being very white, like noticeably white, like shiny white, and as well as being tall. And she said there was something, and it seemed to be looking from behind trees. And then she gradually started describing a creature with arms swinging, walking on 2 legs, which obviously is not a moose. Now, and she was totally fascinated. And we had very, very different responses. And I immediately, and this is something which I'll always remember very clearly, as she was just like standing there, almost like she wants to go walking off in the direction of whatever this creature was. I simultaneously, in contrast, had a really, I became overcome with a kind of panic. Now, I cannot exactly explain that, because if somebody told you that there was a really terrible looking crazy thing out in the front yard, and you looked out the window and you didn't see anything there, you probably wouldn't normally panic. So whether this is something that you can attribute to the stories that people say that a Sasquatch can project sort of energy and create fear in people, didn't create it in her. It created it in me. I was really, really scared. And so I kind of like grabbed her by the hand and said, look, I think we better get out of here. It's time to move. And she didn't want it. She was kind of like, why are you so freaked out? Why? And I couldn't really explain it. But anyhow, I convinced her that it was time to go. And so we headed up the path. Meanwhile, I'm thinking, because of my background in the subject from years before, I hadn't thought about this. So it was the last thing on my mind at this point in my life. But it did bring back memories of my interest in not only the course in evolution that I had taken back at Harvard all those years before, but even earlier when I was, kind of interested in the stories of the abominable snowmen. So anyhow, we got back to the car, drove back to the place that we were living, which at the time was a an 18th century restored, very small house. It had been built by a saddle maker actually in the first year of George Washington's presidency. So it was, and the guy that owned it had restored it. So the environment was, and it was right next to the edge of this other big forest, which in turn was next to the Quabbin forest. So it was a real rural setting, to put it mildly, and kind of picturesque. And so she was all kind of like amazed, and she's got more sensitivity and she's got more abilities in some way than I do, by a lot. She's also like one of those people who's really smart in ways that I'm not. One of those people that can do math and do all sorts of high science and everything really much more easily than I ever could. So she's the opposite of being flaky. She's very emotional and empathic, but she's really, really brilliant. And in ways that I'm not gifted in those ways. And so she's the last thing she's a very rational person. And so I just said, well, I immediately had thought Sasquatch or something like that, because it's a subject I've been interested in. So I said to myself, well, let's just Google Sasquatch at the Quabbin Reservoir. And we did that. And lo and behold, we're immediately taken to a video of some guy who seemed to be a little flaky to me, but he was talking to another guy who was just a local fisherman, your typical outdoors guy that likes to go fishing in the Quabbin. And that guy was explaining how he had been out in an area about a mile from where we were, just doing one of his normal fishing excursions. And he had seen this creature that was very, very tall and walking on two legs with long arms and white, walking through the woods. Now, the chances of somebody that we had never heard of or had no connection to having a similar experience to what we had just had at that moment was really overwhelming. She was overwhelmed. I was overwhelmed. And it really kind of blew our minds. We didn't know what to make of it. The next day, I think it was a weekend day. I'm trying to remember, but we felt like we had to clear our heads, and we wanted to go take a hike, but we did not want to go back to the Quabbin. I was too freaked out, and I think she was a little freaked out. And yeah, I like to collect rocks, and so we went to some really nice stream beds up the other side of the county, up in actually the other side of the Connecticut River. There's some real beautiful deep ravines and creeks where there's really good rock collecting. And it was a beautiful day, and it was warm, and it was, we still got to get outside, and we'll just got to collect ourselves. So we drove up there just to do something different, but to keep, not to let the sunny day pass us by. And so we got to this pull-off spot and parked the car, which in those days was a little red Honda CRV, an old CRV. And there was one of those steel fences you have to sort of, hitch yourself up and put your leg over and then get the other leg over. And I was just in the middle of getting over the fence, and then I could see that she was looking at the hood of the car, and she said, "Hey, look at this." And so I said, "Okay." So I got back to the roadside of the fence and came over, and there on the hood of the car, there was clearly, it was faint, and you could only see it when you had to get the light just right. But there looked to me to be an enormous handprint. Now, this is the car that we had parked down at the Quabbin, the day before, when we'd had this enormous, this completely weird experience. And I have pictures, they're in my book. I just whipped out my iPhone and took a couple of pictures of it, and you can see that handprint. And I'm not making this stuff up, and it's like twice as big as my hand. And it almost looks like, well, if it's a sweaty day and your hands are dirty, you put your hands on a car, you'll see that you'll leave handprints on a car, like fingerprints, only they're exaggerated under those circumstances. And so that was kind of the beginning of this whole journey, and it lasted. That was in September. It pretty much lasted for the next year. She stayed in that house a little longer than I did. I moved out to another place back in the town of Northampton, but we always stayed very close and in touch. And even before, while we were still there together, a lot of anomalous, strange experiences happened during that whole winter that followed the encounter. And that's kind of what this book is about. And to this day, I have a very hard time. The reason I say impossible being is because it's a being, it makes no sense. There's something like this wandering around within 10 miles of the University of Massachusetts and close to some pretty major towns, and yet it makes no sense that random people are describing the same thing if it doesn't exist, people who have no connection to each other, as we had no connection to those two people that we encountered in that video. It makes no sense that random people are describing the same thing if it doesn't have some existence in the real world. So we went through a whole series of bizarre things. Sometimes it seemed like there was a sort of a poltergeist-like activity happening in the house. Donna occasionally found things that looked like little tokens. I came away believing that the interest that this creature had was in her and not in me, for sure. I think that she has a particular, we do a lot of hiking together, and every time we hike, it always seems like the animals make themselves appear. She's got a very pure, benign presence, and I think she sort of brings out the wildlife. Creatures kind of trust her or something, and when they see her, they recognize something. I don't know. I'm just wildly speculating. But I went through the up and downs of belief and disbelief, and frankly, in a way that I'm not really proud of, I became more public about it. Whereas to her, it was a private experience. I understand that now better than I did then. She didn't want to be blabbing on about it, and I was, all excited about what was going on. And to me, it answered a lot of questions that I'd always had based on my academic background in the subject years ago. But I feel like I was kind of insensitive on that front. But she had a deeper connection to what was going on in reality than I did. I was more like the objective bystander doing the narrative in some ways, like the guy Marlowe in Conrad's novels about things going on ocean voyages. But at any rate, to this day, I don't know exactly what to make of the experience, except that a lot of strange stuff happened, and that's what I wrote about. I decided I would just keep a journal of it. And she did her own writing about it. And for a while, we did these two parallel things we wrote together. And then eventually we ended up doing our separate projects. She has done some writing about it herself. And I might send you the links to her stuff as well, to the extent that she wants it out there. I'm not sure about that. At any rate, at times, I really felt like we were under some kind of a spell during that period, the period of that winter and on into the spring a little bit. And sometimes it would all seem completely unreal. We had various weird encounters. I remember one in which I came back from working downtown, and we both knew that simultaneously we had decided that we were going to go take a walk back to that part of the Quabbin where we hadn't been in a long time. And we just knew it, and we barely had to speak to each other. We knew that we were going to go back there. Okay, we're going to go back there that day. And we went back there that day, and then it was another beautiful day, and it wasn't like there was anything completely strange going on. We were walking along a trail, and all of a sudden I heard a whistle coming from our right as we were walking, basically in the direction where we parked the car. And the whistle was louder than anything I've ever heard in my life. It was like a referee, like a football referee's whistle. It's like there was a football referee about 10 yards away in the underbrush. We couldn't see anything. Absolutely everything looked normal. Didn't see anything. This enormous whistle erupted out of the brush, and a flock of turkeys went scurrying across the road. That was it. Just that one whistle. But that whistle was unlike anything I've ever heard. And then if you look at Sasquatch lore, I didn't even realize this until after that fact. You find that Native Americans in the Northwest always carved pictures of the Sasquatch with its mouth or its lips pursed and whistling. And evidently, that's part of this whole syndrome, or not syndrome, or this whole behavior pattern of whatever this creature is. And then there was sort of what was the climax to me of that period of my life and our lives, particularly for me. More things happened to her, and she, like I say, was in many ways more connected. So when I describe those things in the book, sometimes I'm experiencing things, but I was keeping a journal of events because I knew I would forget about this stuff. And even to this day, there's things I won't remember unless I go back and read it. So when I finished up the book, I edited it for grammar and stuff like that, but I wasn't making stuff up that I hadn't recorded as it happened, because I knew it was also weird. It would go in one ear and out the other or something like that. And but what for me was kind of a climax was that at one point we were hiking back in the same gate. They call them gates. There's places where you can park a car and you can walk into the Quabbin. It's open to fishing and recreational hiking. You can't take dogs in there. You have to have a license to go fishing or to do any boating. It's strictly regulated because it's a very ecologically sensitive place. So we're walking along the shoreline very near where this thing had happened, and all of a sudden a rock that was bigger than I could have thrown came sailing out through the trees and landed in the water with a big splash. I guessed it was maybe 30 yards out in the water. And that was something that no mortal man could have ever done. I'm sure of that. And that was sort of for me, not necessarily for her, that was the last really concrete manifestation of this phenomenon. And then later, I think if I recall correctly, it's all there in the book. At the end of that summer, when neither of us was living there again, but occasionally would go back, at one point it seemed like there was another handprint on the car, which almost symbolically seemed like to me, it felt like a goodbye or the end of this bizarre experience, which I can't really explain, because even though I can think of theoretically what a Sasquatch is and look at it through the eyes of somebody that, in another lifetime, I might have gone on and become an anthropologist or something. I was always into that stuff, but that's not the way life worked out for me. But so it seems almost like a bookend to the experience of that first day and the second day where a handprint had appeared on the car. So that's kind of a nutshell summation of the whole thing. And it's interesting, too, that other reports historically have occurred in that same area. I did find out during this period that a guy who I was aware of, who was kind of he was a very famous Harvard anthropologist named Carlton Kuhn, and he was a physical anthropologist, and he taught at Harvard for a number of years, long before I went there. I think he left in the 50s or retired or whatever. He had passed away before my time, but he became very interested in the subject, and based on reports that I learned were over the border in New Hampshire, about 30 miles away from where the Quabbin actually is. He'd gone out and had his own investigation, and he basically some campers had described having their camper, like a VW camper, rocking back and forth when they woke up one morning, like somebody big was pushing it around, and they freaked out. And they said there were these big footprints, and Carlton Kuhn had heard enough of these stories, so he decided to go out that way, and he took plaster casts of those footprints, and he eventually came to the conclusion, consulting with some other people, I think a couple of other anthropologists in Pennsylvania, which was another hot spot traditionally. He came to the conclusion that he said, well, the most logical explanation is it's somewhere in North America, there is a small population of very big, really large, unidentified primates. That was a tenured professor at Harvard. Once again, he was not popular. He was tenured, but he ruffled a lot of feathers. He was very politically incorrect because he talked about differences in different populations in terms of their physical and mental characteristics, and that was something that was politically as incorrect as you could get. And given the mixed up population we have on the planet, it doesn't really have any meaning anymore anyhow. So that was an interesting footnote to the whole thing. And so that, in a nutshell, is the story. And a lot of the weird stuff that happened in between is in the book, blow by blow, day by day.
It is really a fascinating story, and you're absolutely right. Many more details, but I do have some questions for you, absolutely. Just so the listener knows, what year did this start to happen?
This whole long series of encounters, started in September 2014, and by 2015, we had both moved to different places. We were always in touch, and to this day, we still will go back and take hikes there, and but it was basically the intense part, particularly for me, was sort of the early autumn of 2014, all the way through the following year. And those dates are right. I think the dates are right in the book there. So that's the time frame. Yeah.
You mentioned that Donna at points would find tokens around different areas. Can you share a little bit about what kind of things were maybe being left in a gifting situation?
I think sometimes it would just be a really interesting little rock. It looked kind of like gem-like. And we couldn't tell, and she's the last person in the world who would say, this proves that somebody was, this amazing creature was giving me gifts. She's not trying. Once again, this woman is as rational and academically brilliant as you're going to find. Kicks my butt all the time. Anyhow, but they did show up, and the other thing was blue jay feathers, which seemed to show up when you weren't expecting them. And that seemed to be happening. And there was another guy, we mentioned Ness, another guy we ran into this other guy. I can't even remember now how we ran into him. And he was going through similar experiences, and he had another sighting of something big and white at the Quabbin, and somebody put us in touch with him. I've lost track of him. I think that she may still be in touch with him periodically, And all of our lives have changed dramatically, since those days. There was one point when, she had sort of symbolically left a necklace sort of buried in a spot where nobody would find it. And when we went back there, it was gone, and I don't know how that was gone.
Wow.
There was a time when and there's pictures of this in the book there where there was a one of the trails that we typically took, because we were always hiking in these areas. This was how we spent free time. We would hike and explore the countryside. And there was one time when there was a tree. It was a young beech tree. It was a sapling, but it was big. It was like maybe 3.5, I don't know, probably 4 to 5 inches wide. Something had taken that tree and bent it with such force that the bark split vertically up. And the tree was down across the road. It was almost like, folks, stay away from here. Just don't come down here for a while, okay? It was a healthy tree. The wood was green. And I don't even know how you could do that. If you had a backhoe, you might end up pulling the roots up before you break a tree like that. The force it would take to break a young, healthy beech tree, to just bend it to the point where it actually splits vertically, up and down part of its trunk in order to bend. I mean, I can't explain that. I can't say that the Sasquatch did it, but it did seem to be symbolic. And that's all I can tell you. I don't know. I mean, it's
from what I remember from the book. So I believe the gentleman you're talking about that also had the white Sasquatch sighting in the Quabbin, his name was Matt, and I think you had met him through Jonathan Wilk with the BFRO in Squatchachusetts. Yeah,
that's right. That's right.
Which, I mean, that group, the Squatchachusetts group, does great work. Love those guys, and if they're listening, would love to talk to anyone from that group. Now, something I've heard I've taken lots of reports, a few reports from Massachusetts over the years. Have you ever heard of any Bigfoot sightings in this area, the Quabbin, where it resembles more of a orangutan look at all?
No, I don't. Not to the extent. No, I don't think I've heard of that. I have heard of people, and some of this goes back historically quite a long time too. But I have heard of people. The idea of a white one was not expected. That would seem to be rare. Although there's millions of creatures will sometimes be white and sometimes be other colors. So that's not that odd a thing. But I've heard of other dark brown colored ones that other people claim to have seen, and I do mention in the book too that there is a long history of this in New England, going all the way back into native lore. So it's not, whatever the phenomenon is, it's not just the West Coast.
Oh, absolutely. There's a lot that goes on in the Northeast. The orangutan type one I'd heard from an individual was actually southern Quabbin area around Route 9, kind of by the Herman Covey WMA, was crossing the road there. Now, do you have any thoughts at all? Do you think there might be a possibility that Sasquatch has a connection to music or musical patterns or anything like that?
Well, the only thing that I can tell you in regard to that is I have no idea. But and I think I mentioned this in the book. There was a night, I know that we were both, at least that night, we were both staying in that old house there in Pelham. And I had a musical gig at a musical festival because, I've been a musician and I've done a lot of record albums over the years. And this is the last thing that's connected to the Sasquatch world, But I was a guest with a pretty well-known jam band called Max Creek. And they were headlining this big festival. And one of their trademark songs is a sort of a trademark song of my own called Old Stones and Broken Bones. I was up there playing that song, and with that group, and it has a very distinctive rhythm pattern. It's 1, 2, 3, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 1, 2, 3. Like it's a distinctive meter. And there was this tapping outside the house about the same time I was playing this tune with this band at a festival. Supposedly there was this tapping that was in the same rhythm, and Donna was making note of it. Neither of us put it together for a while. There was this weird rhythmic tapping outside the old house, and I was playing a song that is based on that one riff, rhythmically riff, if you were to write it out. And that's the only thing I've never even thought about Bigfoot or Sasquatch or any of this stuff in relation to music, but music is kind of universal across a lot of different creatures, probably, I think. And as you know, maybe there's more and more evidence that some earlier forms of man, like even Neanderthal, appear to maybe have some kind of interest in music, or even, I think that's one of the newer ideas that's out there. So, but yeah, that's all I know about that. I have no idea.
Yeah, it is a thing where it kind of comes up in different ways in reports. Like sometimes people will hear what to them sounds like singing in different parts of the U.S. and Bigfoot related areas. And sometimes, if you hear wood knocks, there usually be in a pattern of 3. And that's me speaking from experience. It's pretty weird stuff. So I don't know, there might be something there for sure. Now, you've been looking into this subject for a long time. And you kind of alluded to it a little bit. So have you heard Bigfoot reports from other people in the area that you've talked to, maybe people working out in the forests or things like that?
I haven't heard anything recently, but my life has taken me in very, very different directions, I mean, we've had so much crazy history in the years between, the last 10 years. I mean, think about it, between all of the crazy times and all of the other stuff going on, and every once in a while, we still run into really weird stick structures. As a matter of fact, I know that we were hiking in an area. You maybe remember. The whole Mount Holyoke Range and Mount Tom and all that.
Oh, absolutely. Stuff. There's lots of stuff that happens up there. Yeah. Yeah,
because there have been. This isn't new, but back when this was happening, there were reports coming from there about really weird screams and, the kind of sounds that I don't think they would have come from a cougar or a mountain lion. They do occasionally show up here. There's too much proof of that. They don't like to admit it, but they're out there. I know. I can't count on both hands all the people I know that have seen them, and I've even seen pictures that people have taken. Things drift apart, and I know that our friend Matt has drifted off. I haven't talked to him in a few years now. And a couple of things, and I'm speaking purely for myself. This is not for her or for anybody else, but there was a period when all this was happening where I kind of felt like I was under some kind of a spell. Now, people could jump at that and say, well, that just shows you because you were like imagining everything and your psyche was creating all this. Well, the psyche didn't, my psyche didn't bend that birch tree over the road, and it didn't throw that stone, which I could barely lift 30 yards out into the water through the trees from God knows how far away. So I don't know what to make of that. But I can say that when I have gone back to some of these same places, everything seems like it's returned to normal, at least in recent times. That could change at a moment's notice. I have no idea. I had one weird experience in Connecticut a couple of years after that. I was visiting my daughter, and she had a little small dog, and she'd rented it was a pretty little funky house, but she likes the outdoors too, and it was on a nice piece of property. And one night the dog went running off into the woods, yapping and barking and going like crazy. And she had injured her foot. I think she had her leg and her foot in a cast, and I think she broke a bone in her foot. And I said, "So okay, I'll go try to find the dog for you." And I went out there and I never found the dog, but I shined this light. And then I saw these two eyes staring at me from the woods. This was near Litchfield, Connecticut, where there have been some weird things, And at first I thought, oh, that's some kind of a reflectors on a road, on a sign or something. Because, I mean, this is an area that was surrounded by malls and shopping centers, even though there was a lot of land in this one little patch of ground. And I remember seeing it looked like two eyes staring. And I thought, well, that's just reflectors on something. There's nothing. Because it was way high up. It was like 7 feet off the ground anyhow. And so I put the flashlight down, and I couldn't find the dog. And then I shined it back there, and I did that a couple of times, and the eyes didn't move. And then the third time, I raised the flashlight beam and shined it into the woods. And then I saw the two eyes that looked like eyes, and they looked like they were staring at me. And then they turned, just the way two horizontally spaced eyes would turn, so that visually the distance between the 2 points narrowed. And then I heard something slowly moving through the trees that sounded like it was on 2 feet. I had no idea what that was. Maybe it was a deer, and there was a little bit of a higher ground there. I don't know. I didn't see any high ground when I went back the next day. So that was one weird experience. And then another time in the 2 years afterwards or so, my daughter and I walked back to the Quabbin and hiked around there for a while. And we were hiking in the same area where a lot of this stuff had happened. And my daughter is kind of like psychic. Said she thought there was something interesting up. And we climbed up this rough bank, and we found this very interesting stick structure. It just made no sense, because it was not something that, it wasn't that big, but it was abundant. Obviously it had been made, and we couldn't see any purpose for it. I mean, why anybody would have done it. And it wasn't in a place that anybody would logically see. And because it was an odd place that you wouldn't typically walk through or around to see it. So that was weird. And then she was kind of like on some bender for exploring, and the reservoir was lower at that time, and we went out onto a point of land that was normally under a few feet of water. And I have pictures of this. This happened after the book, so there's nothing in the book about it. But there was these footprints, and it was very muddy, so you couldn't tell. And they were really, really deep. I mean, they were like really deep, and they were about the general shape of of a giant human footprint, but it was too muddy to see them clearly down there. But it was like 1, 2, 1, 2, and moose tracks are abundant in they were all over the same area. They're very, very different. They look like a horse or a deer. They're ungulate tracks. I had no idea what the heck that was. They were bigger than even a Sasquatch footprint could have been. I have no idea what it was, but they really looked like some sort of generally human-shaped footprint, but the bottoms were obscured because it was, slushy. But it wasn't that slushy. I mean, you still had to be very heavy to impress it that far down, because there were moose tracks from the same period. And a moose track is a much smaller track, and a moose is a big animal. And they were nowhere near as deep. Not even, I don't know what that was. I have no idea. Maybe it was a Sasquatch. Who knows?
What length would you estimate the tracks to be?
They were like over 20 inches.
Wow, that's like Pacific Northwest size, dude.
22, 23 inches.
Yeah,
and
totally.
They were like 4 feet stride.
Okay.
Something like that.
But were they in a straight line?
Yeah, no, they were basically in a straight line. They came up. There was a channel. There was woods on one side where hunting and fishing and everything. You're not supposed to go there. There's a big area of the Quabbin, which is off limits. I think they give like 20 deer permits a year or something you can buy if you want to, but it's off limits to hunting and fishing and everything. You're just supposed to stay away from there. And there was a stream, a feeder stream that came into the reservoir at this area. And there was a channel coming out of that feeder stream. And the tracks emerged out of that channel coming from the direction of the Prescott Peninsula. They came up onto this point of land, which isn't always there, only there when they lower the reservoir enough. Then they proceeded out the length of the peninsula, and then they just like walked off into the water. It was a very weird thing.
So you're saying you're really like, that's really not public access? I didn't know that.
Yeah, no, that area is not, it's not public access. Most of it's off limits. You're not supposed to go there without a special permit, or, and I know that there are certain, I think that a certain number of hunting licenses are giving out for that area. At least they were, because they were concerned about there being too many deer.
Sure.
But I don't think anything else. I think that's the extent of it. There's only certain parts of the Quabbin where you're allowed to fish.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, they're strict about it. And they even patrol it with boats. Like if you're doing stuff you're not supposed to be doing, they'll bust you. They don't want you in every area.
Yeah, absolutely. I would say, listeners, you definitely want to do your due diligence to always look at areas and see what the limitations are that you can legally go to before you just go to an area. So doing due diligence is make sure you look it up yourself with your local law enforcement. But wow. And there's one last question, and thank you so much for your time today, John. But and this has already been asked, but I'm kind of also asking it for the listeners as well.
Sure.
If there is anyone that has ever heard anything Bigfoot related or experienced anything Bigfoot related in the Franklin County area, I would love to talk to you about it. And I would love if you could reach out to me, bigfootsociety@gmail.com. One day I will have an episode that I'll be able to say, yes, that happened in Franklin County. This is kind of a thing I'm working towards. So it sounds like you haven't really heard anything from that area yourself, though, correct?
I am trying to remember, because you're jogging my memory now, because as I've said, my life has moved on into so many other different subjects. And I've got other book projects that I've been involved with. And for a while, during most of the time between when this happened and now, I was a writer in residence at an historic house in Amherst, which has basically been devoted to poets and writers of poetry. And I did do a book of poetry, and I have been a songwriter. And that was, that kind of work was my own younger days, and when I studied English literature, that's what I studied. I was fascinated with anthropology, and I studied it at Harvard, but I wasn't one of the guys that majored in that stuff or anything like that. So, but something is, I'm seeming to remember something about Northfield, your own hometown, which is a very wild place.
It is.
And I'm trying, yeah, I mean, that's wild, rugged, strange country. And a lot of it's swampy and boggy. So I do know your area up there. And maybe I'll email you if it comes back to me.
Such an interesting conversation. And, John Coster, thank you so much for coming on the show. I really hope that people, take a look at your book, Convergence: Encounters with an Impossible Being. It really is a fascinating read. I highly enjoyed it. You can get it as an ebook or you can get it as a physical copy on Amazon. I really recommend people pick up a copy. It is a cool read about an area where there's not a lot of Bigfoot related things written. So definitely recommend to pick it up. But thank you so much, John. Is there a way for people to check out your music?
I'm not hard to find online. I mean, my music is at John Coster, which is just JOHNCOSTER, johncostermusic.com. And there are albums, there are links to albums, and you can buy albums there, and you can, some cases you can go to places where you can download them and stuff like that. Yeah. And also I think there are links to this book and to the poetry book. And that's what my life has been about. It's been about writing and doing music. And so this was not something I ever expected to be. I never expected to. As a matter of fact, I was really beginning to do a whole nother historical book based on a box of letters of Revolutionary War letters. I still haven't gotten it done because so many things keep coming between me and it seems. And but I love the outdoors, and New England is actually an unusual place because people don't think about New England oftentimes as being, and a lot of it's really overbuilt, lower parts of it and everything. But a lot of the ecology in New England is pretty robust. I live now, actually, where I'm living now is out in a place called Shutesbury, which is, once again, I'm probably only 3 or 4 miles as the crow flies from where all this stuff happened years ago. It's a beautiful countryside. It was heavily logged over and cut down, and sheep farms were everywhere back 150, even 200 years ago. And a lot of the forest has come back in New England, and New England has a lot of wildlife, and there are a lot of pockets that are pretty ecologically rich. More so now. I mean, bears are just all over the place. And, when I was a kid, I always thought, wouldn't it be cool to see a bear? Now you see them all the time. I mean, not all the time, actually, but they're really common. And they're thriving. So, people will tell you that if bears can thrive, supposedly a Sasquatch can thrive. I don't know. I don't know how that all works. And I have, there's a guy that is a very close friend of mine, and he had enormous footprints show up in his backyard. What is it? 2.5 years ago.
Oh, really?
December. I mean, they were just ridiculous. You can see the toes and everything. It happened at it was a day when there'd been a very light snowfall. It was kind of slushy, and the dogs went crazy at about 3 o'clock in the morning. He was out pretty far out in the country, and that's over near Granville, which is heading west into the Berkshires. I mean, once again, he is on the edge of a very big national forest. And there are other stories and reports from that area as well. And I've encountered a couple of those. I haven't encountered anything particularly new around here. So whatever this phenomenon is, it does appear to be in New England. And those footprints were just amazing.
Yeah,
I do have pictures.
I'm not surprised. That Granville area is extremely active right now. I've talked to a few people about that area. It's pretty wild up. Cobble Mountain specifically, that area of Granville.
Well, that is so interesting because this all, he called me up and said, "You got to see these footprints that showed up in my backyard the other day." And the footprints they walked all the way down this long field across this area where he's got equipment stored, like he does logging work and stuff like that. And these are big footprints. I forget, I think they're like 18 inches or something like that. And there are bare footprints, and you can see the friggin' toes. Now, you tell me what's going on. Does he have a gigantic, crazy neighbor who wanders around in people's backyards in the middle of the night, scaring the dogs? I don't think so.
Yeah. No, absolutely.
In Granville, if you did that, you'd be likely to get shot. It's like it's a rural community. It's not like the university town of Amherst. So
yeah, a little bit different. It is so active down there. They actually call it the Cobble Mountain Critter, and they have a festival for it that started this year too, which is pretty wild.
This is so interesting. See, this is something I never even knew about. Wow.
So people keep that in mind for maybe next year. But yeah, John, thank you for taking some time today, chatting about your experiences over the years. And it's been a pleasure to have you on the show. And listeners, make sure you go check out his book. Will be linked in the show notes, and you can check that out and read the rest of the story for yourself. But thank you again for coming on, John.
My pleasure. Thanks a lot. And I'll be looking to see what other new exciting news you're turning up, because it is a fascinating subject. And I think it has significance for the crazy time that we're living in. Whatever's happening to the Bigfoot or the Sasquatch or whatever these things are, they're not worried about, being monitored too closely by the government. They don't pay taxes or have a social credit score they're trying to maintain.
Exactly.
So they learned something that it's probably we'd all be better off if we understood. So anyhow, on that relatively humorous note, thanks a lot, and it's been nice talking to you. And I'll be following what you're up to.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Bigfoot Society podcast. Every encounter we share reminds us that the world is bigger and stranger than we think, and that the truth is often hiding just beyond the tree line. If you enjoyed this episode, please be sure to subscribe to the channel on YouTube, hit the bell so you don't miss the next episode, and share this with a friend who's into mysteries, monsters, or the unexplained. And if you're listening to us on Spotify or Apple Podcast, please follow the show there and leave us a 5-star positive review, because all that helps more people discover the show. And remember, if you or someone you know has had a Bigfoot sighting, please, I'd love to hear from you. So email me at bigfootsociety@gmail.com and let's start the conversation. If you haven't gotten a chance yet, check out our membership community over at www.bigfootsocietypodcast.com. And that's where you can hear tomorrow's episode today, early and ad-free, and members-only episodes every week. Also, it's a place to connect with other people that are into the Bigfoot subject as much as you are. Thanks again for following along with the Bigfoot Society. Until next time, keep your eyes open, trust your gut, and never stop asking what else might be out there. And see you in the woods.